everyone, to A Good Place, where truth and integrity meet. Every week I introduce you to thought-provoking and compelling premier educators, whistleblowers, best-selling authors, journalists, activists, and celebrities. They all have one thing in common. They are people of truth and integrity, and many of them are considered modern-day heroes. And who am I interviewing today? Well, she's nothing less than an extraordinary woman who has defended our country and a woman who has defied stereotypes and previous standards in protecting our country and people. And her name is Cynthia Beebe. So Cynthia is a retired senior special agent with the U.S. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, known as the ATF. She spent 27 years investigating bombings, arson, murder, illegal firearms, gangs, and other crimes. She was the first woman to be top gun at the ATF Academy, where she later taught as an instructor. Her cases were chronicled in the New York Times, Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, and Ladies' Home Journal, and were covered on ABC, CBS, NBC, PBS, 48 Hours, and the Phil Donahue Show. She is a member of the International Association of Bomb Technicians and Investigators, the International Association of Arson Investigators, and a woman in federal law enforcement. She has a BA in English Literature and a master's degree in journalism, both from Northwestern State. Since her retirement, she has appeared as an expert commentator on law enforcement issues for WGN radio and television. And we will also be discussing her brand new book titled Boots in the Ashes, Busting Bombers, Arsonists, and Outlaws as a Trailblazing Female ATF Agent.
Thank you for having me.
You know, I heard you refer to yourself as Cindy in some of your previous interviews. Would you prefer to be called by that?
Sure. That's what my friends call me. So
okay. All right. So let's jump in here. First things first, I think I wanted to go into a little bit about the history of the ATF and what it stands for. I briefly mentioned it, but I know that it's kind of morphed and evolved into covering more other dangers that are out there as well.
Yes, we still go by the acronym ATF for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, but we're now the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives after the after 9/11, and ATF switched from the Department of the Treasury to the Department of Justice. But at any rate, we started many years ago. We're an offshoot, actually, of the IRS. In the 1920s, our agents fought against moonshiners in the Prohibition days. And then we became involved with guns and gun trafficking and illegal firearms in the Al Capone days. The violence became so outrageous on the streets that the president, FDR, decided he was going to see to it that there was a federal law to deal with hoodlums like Al Capone, and they passed a law called the National Firearms Act, which made fully automatic machine guns illegal and silencers and sawed-off shotguns. And that's really where ATF kind of got its foothold in the gun world.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting that you said that originally it came out of the IRS. So how is the IRS? Why would that be a starting point?
Well, the National Firearms Act, I believe it was passed in 1934. What made the way that the federal government made it illegal to possess a fully automatic machine gun, for example, was you had to pay a tax on it, a federal tax on it, to legally own it. So if you wanted to register your name with the federal government and pay a tax, then you could legally own a fully automatic machine gun. But as people like Al Capone and Babyface Nelson really didn't want to do that, if they were found in possession of a fully automatic machine gun, that was a federal crime.
Mm-hmm. And then again, I was reading the history, and I guess originally it did start out as alcohol and tobacco, as you had mentioned. And I read, though, that after the assassination of Kennedy, that's when firearms were included. Is that true?
Well, that's when the gun laws really, really expanded. It was called the Gun Control Act of 1968. I write about it in my book. And after President Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Robert Kennedy were all assassinated, there was a very large omnibus bill passed that changed the ownership of of guns in the United States forever. It affected how gun dealers sell them, and it created laws that required gun dealers to keep track of who was purchasing guns, for example, and how many guns they bought and how much ammo. And it made a list of prohibited persons. For example, a felon cannot legally own a firearm in most cases. That came from the 1968 Gun Control Act.
I see. And let's go back just a little bit. I'm very curious about your background. So you grew up in Chicago. Yeah. In the 60s. What was that comparatively to today's Chicago? What we see here in Chicago is, as far as crime goes, and the general feel of the community you grew up in? Because I think of Chicago as having some, there's some, the mob has been central figure there, as well as other crimes. And when I think about it, I think about crime. I know that the crime is something that has been concerning in Chicago itself. So I'm curious to hear your take on that.
Sure. Well, when I was growing up as a little girl in the 1960s, I grew up in a suburb of a kind of a white bread suburb, and crime was just not an issue. And I was too little to pay attention to whatever crime was going on in the city. But having said that, the Chicago metropolitan area is almost 6 million people. It's absolutely gigantic. And the city of Chicago is also gigantic. A lot of people don't have a good grasp of just how big Chicago is. So yes, nowadays there are certainly sections of Chicago that are beset with violent crime. But that's not true of the whole city, and certainly not of the suburban areas surrounding the city of Chicago.
And I read in your book that everyone just left the door open, and it was just a completely different world. You didn't have to worry about locking, I should specify. And everyone just kind of went to neighbors' houses without even having the parents check with the other parents. And it was just a different world. And I kind of remember that myself.
Yeah. Yeah, it was total. I mean, it was kind of like the Leave It to Beaver show or something. And well, on the door, and the neighbors let you in, and you played for a while, and then you went home, and it really was a different world. Yeah.
Okay, so you weren't exposed to a lot of crime when you were younger, and then you went to school for journalism, it seemed like, and how on earth did you end up with a desire, and what compelled you to get into the field that you ended up getting into?
It was very much serendipity. It was based on, I just happened to be born at a moment in time when the history of our country was changing drastically, and I was there at that moment. So President Nixon signed Title IX into law in 1972, and that guaranteed girls and women rights to educational opportunities, the same as men and boys. And so I was able to play high school varsity sports, for example. I was able to get a full athletic scholarship to Northwestern. All of those things, I was on the cusp of change there. And the same thing happened when I hit my really early 20s. I had gone to school at Northwestern to be a journalist, and I was working as a business journalist. And just as a fluke, I happened to meet a woman who was an FBI agent. And that had never really occurred to me, even though I had thought when I was younger it might be interesting. It just didn't seem like an opportunity that was real. And I ended up, chatting with her and learning about this world. And I decided, well, if I'm ever going to apply, it's now or never. And I decided to apply and give it a try.
Okay. And so you jumped in feet first.
Exactly. It was not, it was something I thought, okay, I will apply. First of all, it's hard to get hired, just numerically speaking. It's not real likely. And I was lucky enough to be hired. And I thought, okay, I was maybe 26 years old or something. And I figured, okay, if I hate it or I'm no good at it or whatever, I have many, many years to build a different career, but I'll give this a try and see how it turns out. And happily, it turned out quite well for me.
And what did you have to do initially? So you applied, and what happened after that?
You hired?
Yeah. So, and also one thing we really need to touch upon, which is very evident in your second chapter. I don't remember the title. I think it was Good Old. I can't even remember what it was. Good something about boys. And so basically, that chapter.
Good guys were always boys.
That's it. Yeah. And so you're entering a field where there are no women other than women typically in the office were secretaries. Is
Yes,
that correct?
yes,
Okay,
yes.
so you were surprised by that.
Well, I wasn't surprised when I started. I knew that statistically there were very few women. And I first worked for about 3 years up in Minneapolis, St. Paul, which is a beautiful town. Um, and when I first showed up, the office was all white men. All the agents were white men, and the secretaries were white women. And here I came in as an agent, and I had a good supervisor who thought that women should be given a chance. And fortunately for me, he was well liked by almost all of the other agents, and that helped me very much. But there were still a handful of guys who they weren't overtly mean to me, but clearly made it clear that they felt that women did not belong as agents.
And some of the comments included that women agents were only good for undercover as prostitutes, and that was at the beginning of your career. What else did you hear? Uh, well, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was literally taken aside on two different occasions by two different agents and very politely informed that women did not belong as federal agents because they could never make a complex case and they would never be able to successfully supervise white men. And I was kind of dismissed after that by these two fellows. And I was so aback and so surprised I didn't respond verbally, but I decided to spend the rest of my career proving them wrong. And I think I did, along with other women and minority agents.
Mm-hmm. And during this time, just to give people the context, this was actually only in the 80s.
Correct. This was the late 80s when I started in Minneapolis, St. Paul. That's correct.
That seems so recent. It's amazing to see how far women have come in the workplace.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And also there's that aspect you mentioned in your book. There was racism, of course, as well.
Yes. Even today, I in the book, I quote an inspector general's report that showed that in the year 2018, still only 16% of all federal agents are women, which is statistically quite low. And federal agencies are apparently, or at least they say, they're making a concerted effort to increase that number. I don't know if they have. It's only 2 years ago, but it's still just 16% of agents are women.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's jump into some of when it started to get interesting. And also, when I say interesting and compelling, it also means dangerous. So, when I was reading your book, it was like an action film in my mind, and it's just some of the things you went through, and some of the individuals and the criminals and the adversaries were just it was unbelievable. I'm just glad nothing ever really happened. I mean, we'll get to your car, what happened to your car, but let's talk about one of your first cases, because I know in your book you mentioned that case you were very nervous during that time, and when you first arrested your first criminal, I forget how do you refer to them?
Roscoe.
Mm-hmm, Roscoe.
Yes, I was a brand new agent. I had gone to the academy. So I wasn't literally in my first week or anything like that. And I had been trained by a good agent, and I had participated in a number of tactical operations and such. But when it came time for me to arrest my first bad guy, in other words, I wrote the criminal case on him, and I was being given the credit, so to speak, for making the case against him. And he was not, as ATF bad guys go, he was a routine bad guy. He was a felon in possession of a firearm, and I believe he was a minor league drug dealer. So he was not a particularly dangerous bad guy as our bad guys go. But I went with another senior agent to arrest him, and I'd been on the job well under a year, and we showed up at his apartment. It was dark. It was like 5 a.m. in Minnesota, and dark and quiet. And the other agent were sitting in the car, and I saw a shadow pass along the. We were looking in his apartment window, and the blinds were drawn, but I saw a shadow pass along the blinds, and I was so surprised and so startled that I screamed. And I said, oh my God, is that him? And my partner started laughing and he said, yes, that's probably him. And so I started laughing and I calmed down very quickly. But I was nervous, and we did go in. We knocked quietly on the door, and we arrested him, and he came along without any problems. But when I put the handcuffs on him by myself, it was the first time I ever cuffed anyone by myself, and my hands were shaking a little bit, I have to say. But they never shook again after that.
Right. And so then we can go into some of the other stories as well. What also, one thing I wanted to ask you, when you were trained, and this is a question I'll ask about your career as a whole. Did you feel like you were given enough training and had all the equipment you needed and all the information that would assist you in the work that you were doing?
Generally speaking, yes. Although looking back on it now, the physical equipment that we had when we responded to bomb and arson scenes when I first came on the job was laughable, not compared to what we do now. At the time, it was considered okay, but basically we would just walk into an arson scene, with a pair of boots and a blue cotton jacket and maybe a lightweight helmet, and that was about it. And, our faces we'd inhale all these awful fumes, and we didn't have heavy protective gear. Nowadays, what we are issued is light years better than what we were issued then. But at the time, we all thought that was okay. But the training really was quite good, and I was lucky enough to have one or two good agents in Minneapolis, St. Paul, who really taught me quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. But where were you first hired? Because I thought you went to Georgia first.
Oh, Georgia is where our training academy is.
I see. Okay.
The Federal Law Enforcement Training Academy is down in Georgia, and that training is literally dozens of different law enforcement agencies from around the world train there. Primarily federal law enforcement agencies, but also state and locals come in. It's a huge facility. That training, for the most part, really was pretty good. They were very good on teaching people to shoot, on physical training, general legal principles, for example. They were good. And then the ATF specific laws, most of those teachers were quite good.
Okay. And at that point, you were relocated or you were assigned to the Twin City area?
Yes, I was the way it worked then. It's different than the way it works now. But I first reported up to the Twin Cities for a short time, a few weeks, and then I went down to Georgia for my academy classes, and then went back up to the Twin Cities. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And what was your first encounter with a bomb?
Well, I think you're talking about the Lauren Bell Richard case.
Mm-hmm. Which is very fascinating. We probably can spend like 5 minutes on that.
Yes, that was a very, very unusual case. And in fact, that case affected my entire career because it was a major case. It was a very important case. It made national news because two different Minnesota state judges were bombed, had their homes bombed. And the first bombing occurred in 1988. Down in Austin, Minnesota, which is a town about 100 miles south of the Twin Cities. And the house, there was a homemade bomb, and the house burned down to the ground. And to make a long story short, it was a huge disaster scene, and it took days for the first responding fire departments and the Minnesota state fire investigators and the insurance investigators to decide they were trying to figure out what had happened. Was there an electrical fire? And finally, there was enough pressure put that they decided they had to call ATF in, because even then we were known as the fire experts. And thankfully they did call us in because we just have more time, more agents, more expertise. And we did respond. And within a few hours, we were able to determine that the cause of the fire was actually a very powerful bomb had gone off. And then the house had burned to the ground because bomb.
And what was his intent?
Oh, to kill the people.
Okay, to kill them. But then didn't he also blow up his own home, or is that a different person?
That was not him.
Okay.
That was and I do have to be, well, we'll talk more about this case, but the suspect on this case was a prime suspect was a man named Lauren Bell Richard. And I didn't get called into the case as the case agent until after the second bombing, which occurred in 1989. And that was of another judge named Judge Mork. And his house was also blown up. And in that case, there was no question that it was a bombing because he was lucky enough, he and his family escaped with no injuries. And in the first bombing, where the house burned to the ground, just God was on these people's side, and they were literally away on vacation, or they would have all been killed without a doubt.
I never realized the risk that a judge or I understand police officers have a risk too, because if you arrest someone, they might come back to you and try to seek retaliation. But that's just, I just didn't think about the judges and even you yourself.
Yes. Well, what
besides
happened,
the obvious dangers of your work.
right, of arresting people when they're armed or which we train to deal with that. This was different. And I got it called into the case about a year and a half after the first bombing as the case agent. I was quite a young agent, but it was a very unusual case. And I ended up taking the case. I looked into the case, and the prime suspect, everyone understood that he was mentally ill, but nobody knew exactly how. He'd never been diagnosed. And he had been writing absolutely vitriolic letters and postcards to dozens of people in southern Minnesota for years. And he had driven people, they had quit their jobs and moved away, and he'd threatened people with death and harm for years, but had never really been prosecuted for it. And to make a long story short, because he was such an unusual suspect, I ended up taking my case to the FBI Behavioral Sciences Academy at Quantico. And that had just opened up a few years earlier. And it was not yet considered a normal thing to do on a case. It was still very controversial to take a case to Quantico. And there were agents who made fun of me. I was the first ATF agent out of Minnesota to take a case to the FBI Academy there because a lot of people didn't like that. Having said that, the FBI, the Behavioral Sciences Unit, is made up of local and federal law enforcement officers from all over the country, all different agencies. But so I took my case to Quantico, and that changed my career and my life because it was a very difficult, complex case. I was focused on this man, Lauren Bell Richard, as a suspect, and a lot of people thought I was wrong. Because he was, or they didn't really want to deal with him because he was just off the wall. But my team at Quantico all agreed with me. They all thought I was right. They all thought I was conducting the interview correctly. They all thought that my expectations for what would happen were correct. And just being around those experts for that much time and having them corroborate what I believed really taught me to believe in myself and to stand up from what I thought was the evidence. And that made a big difference in this case.
Mm-hmm. And also, I remember reading that people were afraid they were even going to get a conviction because he was so mentally unstable. But because of you, they were able to convict him. Yeah.
What happened was, and again, this is a long story. I'll try to make it short. I believed from the very first day that I was assigned to the case, and I had been a literature major, so I was used to reading very long pieces of text. And Lauren Bell Richard had written literally hundreds and hundreds of postcards and letters and these vitriolic writings. And so I was willing and able to take the time to plow through them all and organize them and analyze them. And I decided from day one that we, meaning the federal government, we had to charge him with a federal crime of mailing threatening communications through the U.S. mail. That is a federal crime, and each conviction is punishable by up to 5 years. And I knew, because there was no physical evidence tying Bell Richard into either one of these bombings, that we were going to have a difficult time proving that he had committed the bombings, even though I believed he did it, and the U.S. Attorney's Office became convinced that he did that as well. I thought all along that we could convict him on mailing threatening communications. And that, in the end, is what happened. He was found not guilty on the bombings, but he was found guilty on the mailing threatening communications and spent almost a decade in federal prison.
I still feel like that's falling short. I mean, you hear about these type of things and just people get away with so much.
Well, this was a very dangerous man, we believed, and we believed that he would continue bombing people. That's why I worked on it so urgently and with so much energy, because everyone at Quantico agreed with me.
Oh, we'll be right back in a minute. Hang on, everybody. Welcome back, everyone. And in case you're joining us a little bit late, I'm here with Cynthia Beebe, and we're discussing her book and her life experiences. Her book is called Boots in the Ashes, Busting Bombers, Arsonists, and Outlaws as a Trailblazing Female ATF Agent. So, Cindy, thanks again for being here. And let's pick up where we left off. We were discussing one of your most complex cases.
Yes, so Lauren Bell Richard, he was tried and charged with 2 bombings, but also with quite a few counts of mailing threatening communications. And he was actually found not guilty on the bombings, but he was found guilty on 5 counts of mailing threatening communications, and he spent nearly a decade in the federal penitentiary.
Okay, and then do these people usually go back to committing crimes in general? Because I don't know the statistics on that. I thought it was extremely high.
Well, he was an unusual man. He was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. So he would not fall into any category of a typical criminal.
Mm-hmm.
He was able to live for many years without getting into trouble. He did go back to prison a couple times for stalking young girls, teenage girls. And he did write a few more letters, but his violent level, went down. He was not as violent when he got out of prison, thankfully.
Mm-hmm. We have 30 minutes left. So did you want to share about another case in particular that people might find compelling? And it's probably dangerous. So I'm just curious to hear maybe one of your cases where you really felt threatened and what you had to do to overcome the fear of trying to basically get someone in custody.
There were 2 other major cases that I did that would fit that. One was a bombing murder, serial bomber. The bad guy's name was William Lennius. But the bigger case I did, in terms of notoriety, the case that received the most attention nationwide and was actually sold as a movie. And anyways, the main bad guy's name was Richard Kagan, and it was a bombing case, attempted murder. Richard Kagan was a well-known Chicago criminal defense attorney and a former assistant state's attorney, and he wanted to murder his wife. His wife was contesting their divorce, and Richard Kagan wanted to marry his much younger girlfriend. And Richard's wife was going to testify at the divorce hearing that Richard had lied on his taxes, and Richard might have lost his law license, and then he would have lost his girlfriend, and so on and so forth. So Richard, who was a successful criminal defense attorney, hired an enforcer for the Hell's Henchmen Outlaw Motorcycle Club. And the Hell's Henchmen at the time were merging with the Hell's Angels. So now they're part of the Hell's Angels. But he had defended the enforcer, who is the muscle, it's the paid hitman, earlier on an unlawful use of weapons charge. So Richard Kagan hired the enforcer. His name was Ronald Petkus, to kill his wife. And Ron Petkus turned out to be one of the most interesting bad guys I ever chased down. He was a stone cold killer, but he was also a very personable and intelligent man. Ron Petkus decided he first stalked Margaret. Margaret Kagan was the wife, and he stalked Margaret for about 6 weeks trying to shoot her. But Ron Petkus refused to assassinate her if her daughters were present. So he didn't shoot her, and he decided to blow her up instead. Ron Petkus had built bombs since he was about 10 years old, and he loved bombs. So, but he was also an enormous man. He was a professional killer. He was about 6'4", 330 pounds, and he was way too big to put the bomb underneath the car, physically too big. So he got one of his cronies, another biker henchman, and got him in on the deal. And he paid this second biker who went by the name Mellon to place the bomb underneath Margaret Kagan's car when Margaret parked her car at a train station in Highwood, Illinois. This was in 1993. And long story short, it was an incredibly powerful bomb. And it detonated. Margaret was in the car. She had just put the car into reverse. It was a booby trap device, and it exploded. And it, fortunately for Margaret, Petkus had meant to have his sidekick Mellon bring a powerful magnet and attach the bomb directly underneath the driver's seat, in which case Margaret would have been blown to smithereens. But Mellon was drunk, and he forgot the magnet. So Mellon ended up attaching the bomb to the fuel tank in the back of the car. And so the back of the car was absolutely destroyed. Flames shot through the car. Margaret saw the windshield melting in front of her. The temperature soared to several hundred degrees, and she thought she was going to die. Thankfully, she had not put on her seatbelt, but she was able to open the door and fall out of her door into the parking lot, and she survived. And that was miraculous. The photographs in my book, you just cannot believe it. And she survived. So it took me, I was the third agent assigned to that case. And it took me a few months, but I was able to track down Mellon and then Petkus. But in the end, the main bad guy was Richard Kagan. And that's who we wanted the most.
Okay. And then I know at one point you did return to Chicago. So I know you're in Twin Cities. And well, maybe I'm jumping ahead a little bit. So that was probably one of the most dangerous situations you were in?
Yes. And actually, I'm sorry, I should have clarified. After the Bell Richard case, I did transfer back to Chicago. I came back to Chicago in 1990. So both the William Lennius case and the Richard Kagan case were in the Chicago suburbs. So we're in Chicago I'm in Chicago in the early 1990s. But when we arrested Ron Petkus, we had a massive team because he was in the Hell's Henchman clubhouse, which is a heavily fortified area. All the outlaw motorcycle clubs have fortified clubhouses with barbed wire, and they're heavily armed and so on and so forth. So we had about 25 agents and Chicago police officers out there to arrest Petkus. We were not going to storm the clubhouse to arrest him. That you never ever do that unless there are really, extraordinary circumstances. We were not about to storm into the clubhouse. On the other hand, when Petkus came out of the Hell's Henchman clubhouse, we did not know how many other bikers would be with them. We didn't know. So we had about 25 agents. Well, when we actually trailed him, he came out with another henchman. They jumped into a pickup truck. They were driving down the busy street in Chicago. And it just so happened that I was in the car that ended up directly behind Petkus. And when I decided to arrest him, I got on the radio, okay, we're going to take him down now. We were in a quiet neighborhood. I just happened to be the first agent to get up to him, and I put my gun in his face. The window was rolled down, and I grabbed him by the shirt and pulled him over, and I dragged him onto the ground. And he was so big that he needed 3 sets of handcuffs to handcuff him behind his back. But he was armed. He had a loaded revolver in his pocket. And he had been arrested quite a few times before. And thankfully, he did not resist arrest at that point. But when I got him in my car and sat him down, and I turned to talk to him, and I told him who I was, he very, politely said, "Oh, if I'd known you were a cop, I would have shot you." And I said, "No, you wouldn't, because I would have shot you first." And much to my surprise, he started laughing, because that's what they respect, is violence. I meant what I said. And I knew he meant what he said. He would have shot me, but he also understood that I would have shot him. no doubt in my mind or in his. And because of that, he respected me. And he became one of my best informants. And it's that simple law of the streets where if I had shown, the slightest hesitation or the slightest fear, he would never.
Vulnerability. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But the fact that I shot right, I said right back, no, you wouldn't, because I would have shot you first. He thought that was the best thing he'd ever heard from a police officer. And he loved me after that. And he became an excellent informant for me.
Okay. Well, that ended up in a way, in a positive way. What did your job entail that you really didn't like? Because I was reading about some of the things you had to do, like after an explosion. And hypothetically, you have to go in there and mark certain areas. Can you share that with the listeners?
Sure. After a large explosion or even a small explosion, it's absolutely crucial for the law enforcement to do an extremely good job at documenting the evidence. And that's true, by the way. Documenting evidence is the key to winning 90% of all cases. You win on documentation. You don't win just on testimony. You have to document what you do, and not just paper documents, but photographs and diagrams and so on and so forth. So there's about 8 or 10 different jobs that agents get assigned to after a bombing. And they're anywhere from photographer and videographer, and you do take interviews and stuff. But occasionally, I would be assigned to be the collect the evidence and do a drawing of the evidence, and that is a very tedious and time-consuming job, and it's a thankless job. And I was pretty good at it, unfortunately. And my least favorite job, because bombs, there are bits and pieces of evidence all over the place. There's shrapnel everywhere.
What about bodies? What about, I think I read that there was a dog and a man, just pieces everywhere.
Yes, that was the William Lennius bombing. That was the other major case that I talked about. And he was also a serial bomber. And he was trying to kill his ex-girlfriend. That was his intended target. But unfortunately, not that I wanted her to die, but unfortunately, the next door neighbor, Lennius, had disguised his second of 2 very powerful bombs inside a brand new bright red toolbox. And the intended victim's name was Ellen, and Ellen's next door neighbor was a very handy construction kind of guy. And William Lennius had left this brand new bright red toolbox out in the parking lot of the condominium or townhouse association. Long story short, Ellen's next door neighbor, Wayne Conrad, ended up in charge of this red toolbox. Well, inside of it was a very, very powerful pipe bomb. And Wayne Conrad was the one who opened or was able to put the key in the lock and turn the key. And it was when he turned the key that the bomb exploded, and it was an incredibly powerful bomb. And his dog was right at his feet when the bomb went off, and he was killed instantly. The dog was killed instantly. His wife was terribly injured. We thought she wouldn't make it. She did survive. One of his 3 kids had literally just seconds before had walked right past Wayne and his dog, and thankfully by that time the boy was outside and was uninjured. But it was a tremendously powerful bomb. And I was not, on that case, I was the case agent. So I was the one in charge of catching the bad guy. And fortunately, I was able to do that night. I got him to confess.
Mm-hmm. We were watching a film, and sometimes films are, far from reality. But I remember seeing that there was pieces of bodies everywhere. And I'm like, is that for real? Is that really what happens? I guess it makes sense. I've just never seen even something like that. And it was so disturbing to me.
It is.
And then I heard from military people. I started, kind of going back and researching a little bit, and military people said the same thing would happen.
Yeah. Yeah, it was the most distressing crime scene I ever saw. I also, there was a few other death scenes that I saw, but that was certainly the most gruesome. It was such a powerful bomb, and he had actually built a second powerful bomb that thankfully had not. At the time, no one understood it was a bomb, and it was still in a box and it did not detonate. We were able to disable that without anyone else being injured.
Mm-hmm. And did you also work for the Secret Service at one point?
Yes, we work with the Secret Service at that time.
I see. Okay.
The way
Eh,
it works, go ahead.
Go
Sorry.
ahead. No, I was just going to say, yeah, I just want to hear your experience and who the president was at the time, and what year that was.
I actually worked quite a few different times for about eight or 10 years with the Secret Service at times. The way it worked was until 9/11, the ATF and the Secret Service, IRS, and Customs were all under the Department of the Treasury. And so we were considered a sister agency to the Secret Service. And on busy campaign years, the Secret Service needed to draw from IRS agents, Customs agents, and ATF agents to supplement their protection details. And I probably worked on 20 different Secret Service protection details through the years. So I protected President Clinton and the first President Bush, and protected Hillary Clinton and Vice President Quayle, and just the list goes on and on and on. And I actually loved we were called OTAs, and that stood for Other Treasury Agents. And I always found the Secret Service, as far as protection details went, they were the consummate professionals. They did a great job, and I really enjoyed working with them.
Mm-hmm. And also kind of opened the door to experiences that you may not have ever had, hadn't you been doing the work you were doing at that point.
I worked President Reagan 2 or 3 different times, and he always seemed to me, in the brief time that I was near him, he struck me as a very gracious man, just as a human being, I should say. There was just something about him that I really did like. But I worked quite a number of people, protected quite a number of people, I should say.
And then let's talk about how it's expanded. Like we were talking about earlier, it was just ATF originally, and now let's talk about what that has expanded to, because there's so many more things that are to worry about, especially with the automated weapons, and even like some of the newer technologies, some of these wireless weapons like electronic assault weapons and things like that. I'm just curious if that's something that is being addressed at this point in time.
Sure. We keep up, obviously, with everything that's happening in the firearms industry. And of course, bomb makers, we have some of the best bomb technicians in the world and bomb investigators in the world. So, and we certainly keep up with everything. What tends to happen is that mechanical innovators, so if like the new bump stocks for guns or whatever, when they come out, it takes some time for laws, whether it's state law or federal law, to catch up to the technological innovations.
Yeah, ding ding on that, because there's so many strange and almost science fiction type weapons coming out, and it's like I was telling people, it's going to take a while for people to catch up.
Yes, right.
Mm-hmm. And then, what's your opinion on gun laws currently?
Well, I certainly, I assume you're talking federal gun laws, and I think by and large, they make sense where they are right now. For example, I'm just speaking about ATF, virtually every crime that we enforce, whether it's gun crime, about 85% of all our cases made are related to guns, whether it's just a gun crime or guns and gangs, guns and drugs. About 85% of our cases are gun crimes, and most of the rest are bomb and arson. But we target almost exclusively violent criminals. We target criminals with a previous criminal history, or they have been involved in a physical
watch listed,
or, well, not so much watch list as they've been involved in a violent crime. Even the circumstances when they're arrested, there's a violent aspect to it. We don't run around, we don't have enough agents, and there's no interest in running around charging people just for administrative paperwork stuff. It's egregious. That just really doesn't happen. There's just not enough agents to do that. Our focus is on violent crime.
And then also, I did want to talk about this, but maybe it's a little bit off topic. The surveillance list, the Patriot Act. How do people end up on these lists? Because I mean, it sounds like to me you had a very specific list of criminals, people that were already committing crimes. So I'm just curious how the watch list works and how you feel about that, because there's a lot of invasion of privacy. There's a huge issues, or people are really upset about the Patriot Act, which is now called the Freedom Act. And I know that it's open to some revisions, but it's kind of been put aside till this coronavirus has been handled. So what are your thoughts and what are your comments and what's your knowledge on that?
I'll be honest with you. My knowledge is not great because it was never invoked in any of my cases, and it was not I was in the Chicago area. It was not commonly used in the Chicago area. So I don't want to pretend that I'm an expert on it. I didn't really even hear very much about it. It was not a tool that the U.S. Attorney's Office used or that ATF agents used in the Chicago office very much. So
That's what I thought after speaking to you for a while. But no one, I mean, I've talked to a lot of people who've worked in similar fields and at agencies, and no one really knows, no one can give me a straight answer about how people are actually ending up on the watch list. Because some people seem fairly innocent. They just don't understand it and how they get off. And so it's just something that's been of interest to me. I wish somebody knew. No one does.
And this is, I'm just telling you this. This is not even from my knowledge of it as an agent, but what you would need to do to get off it, I would assume, in virtually every case in something like this, is to hire a lawyer who's knowledgeable about it. Not that people should be hiring very expensive lawyers all the time, and maybe there's a legal aid society that already knows about it. But I mean, I know a little bit about it, but it was just never anything I used. But so
But how do you even find out you're on it? That's the thing. It's like you can file a FOIA, but because of the circumstances, they'll just say, I don't know, I forget the response because I talk to a lot of different kinds of people, and they just get a non-response, really.
Oh, yeah. I'll be honest with you. I just don't know. I don't want to say something really stupid. And
no worries.
Really don't.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe I could research it and come back another time.
Yeah, it's just something interesting. And as you know, people are really up in arms about it. And even the way that Google and all these different companies, all these online companies and presences pool information. But you know what I want to know is more about you. What are your plans? So you wrote this great book. Where can people buy it?
Oh, well, unfortunately, right now, because of the virus, it's all online. But certainly at Amazon and Barnes and Nobles, at indie bookstores, it's available all over the place online. And it's available on Kindle. It's available by audiobook, whatever format you want to use. Boots in the Ashes is available.
Mm-hmm. It's highly compelling. I actually think it should be made into a film or a streaming series. It really has that in it. And just because you're a woman and what you accomplished as a woman, which we really didn't go to in detail enough. I mean, it's just extraordinary what you've been able to accomplish.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And also, I just have a final question here since we have time. I had a question that would require a longer response, but what would you have done? I mean, I understand you went to school for journalism, but if you were to go down a different path, what would you have chosen?
Gosh, well, yeah, that's a very good question. Maybe being a professor of literature, actually,
Mm-hmm.
or a journalist. I suppose one of those two things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That sounds like it would be appropriate. So plans down the road, are you just going to enjoy this time and retire, enjoy life, or is there any interest in getting involved in some capacity, maybe teaching?
Yes, and I also hope to keep writing books. I hope to perhaps teach some writing, and in fact, I'm going to be doing some teaching by Zoom of law school classes and forensics classes, both in the UK and here in America, of my book and of criminal procedures and forensics and such. I love to teach. I taught a lot down at the Academy, at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Academy. And I do hope to continue to write. For many years, I hope maybe in a couple of years I can come back again and talk to you about another book.
Yeah, it sounds great. You know, a lot of times I'll get a book and there's been a ghostwriter, but I imagine you could have written that all by yourself or pretty
Yeah,
close to it.
yeah, no, I did because my goal was or is to build a second career as a writer. So every word was by me.
Mhm. And then also, how can people follow you, contact you? I know you have a website and a Facebook, a LinkedIn, Twitter. So would you like to share that with everybody?
Sure, thank you. My website is www.cynthiabeebe.com. It's my name, Beebe, and then all of my social media is at Cynthia Beebe and the number 4 at Cynthia Beebe 4.
Okay, thank you for that. And also, if you want to check out some of my previous interviews, you can go to truthfrequencyradio.com. You can also subscribe to me. Just look up A Good Place with Ella. It'll pop up. I also have a website called agoodplacewithella.com. You're feel free to check out some of the interviews there. And it's just been a real treat and a pleasure interviewing you and having this time to get to know you. And I'm sure that you'll be a great success with your writing career. And I appreciate everything that you've done. We just have a couple more minutes here. Is there anything else you wanted to share before we head out?
Just that I hope that people enjoy the book. I worked hard to make it a fast-paced but informative
It
book
is.
and
Mhm.
fun. A page turner kind of thing. And I guess really right off the top of my head, that's about all I can think of.
Okay. Well, then I'll give a shout out to the owners and all the hosts at this radio station, which is Truth Frequency Radio, and you can hear it on iHeart, as many of you are right now. And it's just a phenomenal station. I'm so appreciative. So everybody stay tuned and get your Truth Frequency Radio daily. Keep up on time and extraordinary. Thank you so much, Cindy. We'll speak soon.